start moving west into the state of Louisiana by then, and they hear these people saying Cajun, Cajun, and what they heard was, oh, you're a Cajun. So it's an Anglo corruption. The word Cajun is considered to be an Anglo corruption of the word Acadian. So that's where that comes from. And y'all, this is important to know. There's 3 ways to be Cajun. The first way to be Cajun is by the blood, meaning you have some ancestry in Acadie. You can be Cajun by the blood, by the ring, you marry into a Cajun. And the third way to be Cajun is by the back door. And we let anybody in the back door that wants to come. Right, Denise? We let you in the back door, right? Don't you feel Cajun? You don't have to be here long before you start feeling like you're Cajun. It's, you know, people say they're Cajun whether or not they know if they have any ancestry in Acadie. That's because they're Cajun by the back door. Their family's been living here. They've been living here. They can pronounce all the names. They have some crawfish boils in their backyard a couple of times a year, and you know, so they just and they take part in the joie de vivre. That's kind of what this area is known for. The joie de vivre, which is joy of life, joy of living. You know, which is probably what makes Lafayette the happiest city in the United States. Did y'all know that? Did y'all know that? Harvard did this big several years. They spent several years doing one of their studies. You know, some group did a study, and they ranked all the happiest and least happiest cities. The top 5 happiest cities were in Louisiana. Number 1 was Lafayette. When you think we're on the bottom of every other list, y'all, I mean, education. Long before France claimed that land, they had claimed parts of Canada, the easternmost parts of Canada, the Maritimes, today's New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, parts of Maine, Prince Edward Island, all that area. As early as 1605, they started sending French peasants to colonize that land in Canada to hold a claim. Those French peasants called that area Acadie. They called it Acadie because that is French for Arcadia. Arcadia being a Greek mythological paradise or land of plenty. Anyway, these Acadians, as they very quickly, by the way, started calling themselves, because think about it, they were very, very isolated from France. They were the first people in a whole new world. They were even before, the first ones were even before the Mayflower. They felt like they had their own identity, you know, their own nationality. So they start calling themselves Acadian. They feel Acadian. They lived there for, y'all, generations and generations, all told about 150 years. And they are very resilient people. They live off the land. They become brilliant farmers, fishermen, fur trappers, brilliant at what they do, however uneducated and illiterate as well. The biggest problem they have during that whole time is the British, because the British have the rest of Canada, and the British want to take over Acadie because they want to have their own British settlers on that good farmland. So there's always all kind of conflict. And eventually Great Britain does take over that area. They get it in a treaty in the early 1700s. So then you have British rule over these French Acadian people. Not a good mix at all. And it becomes especially bad when France and England go to all-out war in North America. That was 1755. That was the French and Indian War. England and France, all-out war. England says this is a good time to employ a plan that we today call Le Grand Arrangement. The Grand Arrangement roughly translates to the Great Expulsion or the Great Upheaval. Most people know, if you know anything about Cajun, you know that the ancestors of the Acadian people got exiled out of Canada by the British, right? A lot of people know that, but most people don't realize or stop to think this was war. It was horrific. It wasn't like they kicked them out and they all came to Louisiana. That did not happen at all. Matter of fact, no one came directly to Louisiana. They were shoved onto boats, men first. The men were in the first round, torn away from their families. The men were brought into different ports along the eastern seaboard, the 13 colonies, was the British colonies at the time. The women, they would go back. The British went back later, rounding up women and children after the men were gone. Herded the women and children to the coast with whatever they could carry. Forced them onto later ships. A lot of the later ships, y'all, even went to Europe, England and France. Some of these people ended up in England and France. Y'all, they estimate that about 5,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes like this. And they estimate that about 11,000 people were forcibly removed from their homes like this, and that only about half of them survived to get off of a ship anywhere. And those that did were scattered all over the place for the next 9 years. They're scattered all over the place. Sometimes they end up somewhere they're very unwanted no matter where they go, especially in the eastern seaboard, because England's at war against France, you know. They're not wanted in Europe. Sometimes they get they are dying in the ports. They eventually turn the ship away to go relocate somewhere else, and the people are back on the seas again, you know, dying of diseases and all that stuff. So at any rate, those who survived the 9 years are scattered all over the place. At the end of the war, Spain emerges as the controller of the whole Louisiana territory, that whole huge territory. France had it, and France gave it to Spain during the war. It was the Spanish colonial government that had the great idea to better colonize what was a very struggling Louisiana at the time, because they really didn't have a farming class of people. Spain decides they're going to start giving away land grants to anyone who would come over and farm. Some of the Acadian men were making their way down here about that time. About 200 Acadian men showed up in this area at that time, and they were given these land grants from Spain. And when they started farming the land here, they started realizing that, man, this place has a long growing season, the land is good. This could be new Acadie. We could reunite, our people could reunite here. So they had this idea to start reaching out to everywhere Acadians have been scattered all over the place, and they could move back here, and this could be new Acadie. So they put word out, they get help from the Spanish government, who's still looking for good settlers, right? And they bring, and they get Acadians to come here. And historians say it was almost miraculous how for 3 generations, for the next 40 years, Acadians kept coming and coming and coming. And they estimate that about 5,000 Acadians made their way here over that 40-year period to settle in what they saw as New Acadie. Y'all, we always like to make sure people realize that the Acadians were not the only people coming here, and this culture is the way that it is, not just because of the Acadians. They came in great number, they came in the greatest number, but there were also already Native Americans here who were really good to the Acadians and had a lot to teach us. There were Germans coming. There were French people coming directly from France, a farming class of French people coming. There were Spanish coming during the Spanish colonial period, and there were free people of color who had the right to own land, and they were settling here too. So the very rich culture that we have today is not just because of Acadiana people, but because of all these other extremely rich cultures coming together in this place and getting along and sharing ideas with each other. So a lot of the things that we think of as very, very Cajun actually have their influence from someone else, you know, from some other group of people. But the Acadians here adopted it as part of their way of life. There was a lot of intermarrying between all these groups. And so, you know, so we always say there's 3 ways to be Cajun. By the blood, which means you have ancestry. By the ring, you marry in, like so many do. And then the 3rd way to be Cajun is by the back door. And we let anybody in the back door that wants to come. You know, so basically everyone who lives in this area today considers themselves Cajun, whether they know they have any ancestry, you know, from Acadie or not. One of those things that's very, very Cajun and has influences from somewhere else is next on our menu, and that is gumbo. Very hard to do a Cajun food tour without gumbo, y'all, even in the heat. Gumbo around here is kind of seasonal. We prefer to eat gumbo in the winter when it's not humid and stuff. But I am extremely picky about what gumbo I will have on my tour. There are only about 3 gumbos that I let on my tour. And the one we're going to have right now is a crab gumbo. And y'all, what I was saying about influence, the word gumbo is not spelled E-A-U-X, obviously. The word gumbo is actually a West African word for okra. The African slaves brought okra seeds here from Africa, and that's why we have okra here. And the very first gumbos were soups that were thickened with okra. So they were these thickened soups that were eaten over rice, and they were green, a green soup thickened with okra. My 95-year-old grandmother still makes her gumbo that way. However, you won't find that on any menu anywhere. None that I've seen. Gumbo later, y'all, when okra was not in season, they still wanted to have gumbo, so they started thickening it with roux. And they're using roux already for fricassees and whatnot. Roux is a 1 part oil, 1 part flour, cooked until it's brown, very, very dark brown and thick. And that's really the flavor we think of for gumbo today. So all the gumbos you're going to see in any restaurant around here is going to be a roux-based gumbo. Y'all, a lot of restaurants can mess up some gumbo. That's why I'm extremely picky about the gumbo that's on my tour. My favorite gumbo, y'all, by far, comes from my kitchen. And that is probably true for everybody who lives around here and makes gumbo. And you expect gumbo to taste like the one your mama made, which tastes like the one your grandma made, which tastes like yours. And a lot of restaurants, maybe an outsider would taste it and say, wow, that's delicious, and it probably is delicious, but it doesn't taste like our gumbo. Like they put some weird flavor in there, or they didn't cook the roux down enough and it tastes roux-y, or, something like that. So, my standard is, how much does it taste like mine or my mom's? Now, I actually don't make seafood gumbo, so I have a standard of seafood gumbo based on my mom's seafood gumbo. So that's where this crab gumbo comes. Locals will always say, "Oh yes, that tastes like my gumbo." Yes. So gumbo is very regional. We all expect. I've come to realize since I started the tour and have all these locals eating with me, that we all expect the same flavors from our gumbo. And y'all, some restaurants can put some weird stuff in gumbo. And a visitor from somewhere may taste it and maybe it tastes good, but it's weird to us. It does not belong in gumbo. This is what gumbo should taste like. Isn't it beautiful?